The wildfire had taken everything in a single August afternoon. The house where Mara Chen had lived for all 16 years of her life. The garden her mother had tended until cancer took her 2 years prior. The workshop where her father had built furniture until the accident left him unable to work. And finally, 3 weeks ago, took him too when his grief-weakened heart simply stopped. Now standing at the base of the North Cascades, with the first November snow already falling, and nothing but a backpack containing her father's tools, a sleeping bag, and the clothes on her back, Mara made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who knew her. She would walk into these mountains and she would build something. Not find shelter, not wait for rescue, but build, with her own hands, a place that fire and loss and the cruelty of fate could never take from her again. The snow fell harder. As she began to climb, each flake a small cold promise that winter was coming whether she was ready or not. And somewhere above the tree line, in the vast white wilderness that stretched endlessly before her, lay the raw materials for either her survival or her grave. 3 months earlier, Mara had watched her small town of Brightwood burn. The wildfire had started in the parched forests to the east, pushed by winds that seemed determined to devour everything in their path. Evacuation orders came at dawn, sirens wailing through streets where neighbors emerged, with whatever they could grab in 10 panicked minutes. Mara had helped her father into their old pickup truck, his movements slow and uncertain since the stroke. She'd grabbed the metal toolbox from his workshop, the one thing he'd asked for, his voice barely a whisper, and the photograph of her mother from the mantel. Nothing else. There hadn't been time. The fire had overtaken Brightwood by noon. Mara and her father watched from the evacuation center in the next town as smoke rose in towering columns that stained the sky orange and black. The news showed aerial footage of entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, streets marked only by the patterns of foundations and chimneys that remained standing like tombstones. Their street, Maple Drive, was shown specifically. A before and after that made her father turn away from the screen, his good hand trembling. They'd stayed at the evacuation center for 2 weeks, sleeping in cots among dozens of other displaced, families eating donated food, filling out endless forms for FEMA and insurance companies. Her father had grown quieter each day, his eyes distant in a way that frightened Mara more than the fire had. The doctors at the temporary clinic said it was depression, normal given the circumstances, but Mara recognized something deeper, the particular emptiness of someone who'd lost the will to keep fighting. "We'll rebuild, Dad," she told him one night, holding his hand. "We'll start over." He'd looked at her with eyes that already seemed to be seeing something far away. "Your mother planted that garden when you were born," he'd said, his words slurred slightly from the stroke. "Every spring for 16 years she tended it, and it's gone, just gone." 2 weeks later, he'd died in his sleep at the temporary housing unit they'd been assigned. The doctor said heart failure, but Mara knew the truth. Her father had died, of a broken heart, of loss compounded upon loss until there was simply nothing left to hold him to a world that kept taking things away. She'd had no other family. Her mother had been an only child, her father estranged from his siblings for reasons he'd never explained. At 16, the state would place her in foster care, a fate she'd witnessed before other kids at school. The shuffling between homes, the temporary nature of everything, the constant reminder that you belonged nowhere permanently. The social worker assigned to her case was kind but overwhelmed, managing dozens of wildfire orphans. "We'll find you a good placement," she'd promised, her smile not quite reaching her tired eyes. Mara had nodded, had filled out the forms, had attended the intake appointments, and then, on the night before her scheduled placement, she'd made her choice. She'd taken her backpack, her father's toolbox, the emergency cash she'd found in his wallet, $240, and she'd walked away from the temporary housing unit, away from Brightwood's ruins, away from a future decided by strangers and systems and the random cruelty of fate. She'd walked toward the mountains. Her father had taught her to use tools before the stroke. In the workshop that no longer existed, she'd learned to measure twice and cut once, to drive a nail cleanly, to read wood grain and work with it rather than against it. Her mother, in the garden that had burned to nothing, had taught her about seasons and patience, about how things grew when you gave them time and attention. Both parents were gone now, but their teachings remained, and Mara carried those invisible inheritances with more certainty than she carried the heavy toolbox that made her shoulder ache. The first snow of the season had begun falling the day she started climbing into the Cascades. She'd researched before leaving, using the library computers to study topographic maps and wilderness survival guides. She knew that what she was attempting was dangerous, possibly suicidal. Winter in these mountains could kill the unprepared in a dozen different ways, but the alternative, foster care, the slow dissolution of self in a system that saw her as a case number rather than a person, felt like a different kind of death, slower, but just as certain. She climbed for 2 days, following game trails and creek beds moving steadily higher. The snow increased as elevation grew, first dusting the ground, then covering it in a white blanket that grew deeper with each mile. The temperature dropped. Her breath became visible, her fingers numb even inside the cheap gloves she'd bought at a gas station. At night she made small fires and huddled in her sleeping bag, shivering despite the flames, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. On the 3rd day, exhausted and questioning everything, she found it. A small valley protected on 3 sides by rocky outcroppings that would block the worst of the wind. A creek ran through it, not yet frozen, providing water. Stands of Douglas, fir and western hemlock offered wood for building and burning. The valley floor, though snow-covered now, showed signs of past human presence. The remains of a stone fire ring, half buried in decades of forest debris, and nearby, barely visible beneath snow and fallen branches, the outline of a foundation where something had once stood. Mara stood in the center of this small valley as snow fell around her, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, that was still too fragile, but possibility. This place could work. It was remote enough that no casual hikers would stumble upon it, especially not in winter. It had resources, and it had space to build, to create, to establish something that belonged only to her. She set down her backpack and her father's toolbox, and she began. The first structure was barely worthy of the name. Using fallen branches and the small hatchet from her father's tools, Mara constructed a crude lean-to against one of the rock faces. She cut pine boughs to layer over the frame, creating insulation and water resistance. She dug down through the snow to expose bare earth for the floor, using rocks to ring a fire pit. The work was brutally hard, her hands blistering and then bleeding, her muscles screaming from unaccustomed labor. But the physical pain was almost welcome. It left no room for the grief that lurked at the edges of her consciousness, waiting to overwhelm her if she stopped moving. That first night in her lean-to, with a fire crackling just outside the opening, and her sleeping bag pulled tight around her, Mara assessed her situation with the brutal honesty survival demanded. She had shelter barely. She had water from the creek, though she'd need to boil it. She had fire. Food was her most immediate problem. She'd brought granola bars and jerky that would last perhaps 5 more days if she rationed carefully. After that, she'd need to find sustenance from the land itself, and winter was the worst possible time for foraging. The cold was her second problem. The lean-to helped, but it wasn't enough. Temperatures at night were already dropping into the teens, and it was only early November. By January, they could reach well below 0. Her sleeping bag was rated for 30 degrees at best. Without better shelter, she'd likely die of hypothermia before spring. The tools in her father's box became her lifeline. A hammer, rusty but functional. A handsaw, a carpenter's square, various screwdrivers and wrenches, a level, a tape measure, boxes of nails and screws. These tools had built furniture in her father's workshop, chairs and tables and bookshelves that had paid their bills when times were tight. Now they would build something more essential. The foundation she'd noticed that first day became her target. Measuring it out, Mara found it was roughly 12 feet by 10, a single-room structure, probably a hunting cabin from decades past. The stone foundation remained partially intact, providing a solid base to build upon. If she could construct walls and a roof before the deep cold set in, she might actually survive. But walls and roof required lumber, and lumber meant trees. The hand saw from her father's toolbox was designed for carpentry, not forestry. Still, it was what she had. Mara identified standing dead trees in the surrounding forest, already seasoned wood that wouldn't require months of drying time, and began the agonizing work of felling them. Each tree took hours. The saw blade bit into wood grain with frustrating slowness, her arms burning with effort, sawdust mixing with falling snow. She learned to start her cuts on the side she wanted the tree to fall, to make a notch first, and then saw through from the opposite side. She learned to jump clear when the wood began to crack and groan, signaling imminent collapse. Several times she nearly got crushed, the tree falling in unexpected directions, teaching her through near-death experiences what the survival guides couldn't convey. Once down, each tree needed to be stripped of branches and cut into manageable lengths. Then came the brutal task of dragging these logs back to her building site, sometimes a quarter-mile through snow that grew deeper daily. Mara rigged a harness from rope and her sleeping bag straps, essentially becoming a pack animal, pulling logs that outweighed her through wilderness that showed no mercy to mistakes. 2 weeks into her building project, the first major storm hit. Mara huddled in her lean-to as winds shrieked through the valley and snow fell so thick she couldn't see the tree line 20 feet away. The lean-to groaned and shuddered, its pine bough covering shredding in places, letting wind and snow penetrate. The fire she'd carefully maintained died despite her best efforts, drowned by snowmelt and scattered by wind. For the first time since losing her father, Mara truly believed she was going to die. The cold was savage, finding every gap in her clothing, in her sleeping bag, in the inadequate shelter. She couldn't feel her feet. Her hands hurt so badly she wanted to scream. The shivering was so violent, it felt like her body was trying to tear itself apart. She thought about her parents, about joining them in whatever came after. Part of her wanted to simply close her eyes and let the cold take her. It would be easier than this endless struggle. Easier than the loneliness and the fear and the sheer overwhelming difficulty of trying to survive in a place that seemed designed to kill her. But another part, the part that had walked away from foster care, that had climbed into these mountains, that had chosen building over surrendering, refused. That part made her do jumping jacks inside the tiny lean-to space, made her beat her hands against her legs to force circulation, made her chew on jerky even though her jaw ached from chattering. That part kept her conscious through the longest night of her life. Dawn came eventually, as it always does. The storm had passed. The world outside was buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, and more was coming. The sky held that particular grey heaviness that promised another storm soon. But Mara was alive. Frozen, exhausted, terrified, but alive. She stumbled out of the lean-to on legs that barely supported her weight and surveyed the destruction. Half her carefully gathered logs were buried under snow. The fire ring was obliterated. Her food supplies, hung in a bag from a tree to protect them from animals, had been torn down by the wind and scattered. She had perhaps 3 days of food left if she could find all the lost pieces. "I can't do this," she whispered into the vast white silence. "I'm going to die up here." The mountain offered no comfort, no reassurance. It simply existed, indifferent to her survival or death. Mara sank to her knees in the snow, too tired and cold and scared to cry. She'd failed. The grand plan to build shelter, to survive winter, to create something permanent. It was the fantasy of a traumatized teenager who didn't understand how brutal reality could be. She should walk back down to civilization, turn herself into the authorities, accept foster care as the price of staying alive. She knelt there in the snow, ready to give up, for perhaps 10 minutes. Then slowly, she became aware of a sound beneath the wind. Moving water. The creek still flowing despite the cold. She followed the sound, pushing through deep snow, and found the stream partially frozen, but still liquid at its center. And there, caught against rocks near the bank, something that made her breath catch, a fish. A rainbow trout, perhaps 14 inches long, trapped in a shallow pool by the shifting ice. It flashed silver and pink as it struggled against its confinement. Mara lunged forward, plunging her hands into water so cold it felt like knives, and grabbed the fish. It thrashed in her grip, powerful and alive, but she held on with desperate strength and threw it onto the snowbank where it flopped helplessly. She stared at it for a moment. This unexpected gift, this proof that the mountain could provide as well as punish. Then she grabbed a rock and did what survival required. The fire she built to cook the fish took nearly an hour to start, her numb fingers fumbling with wet wood and the precious matches she'd been rationing. But eventually flame caught, smoke rose, and the smell of cooking fish filled the small valley. Mara ate it half raw, too hungry to wait for thorough cooking, and it was the best meal of her life. The fish didn't change her fundamental situation. She was still dangerously unprepared for winter. Her shelter was still inadequate. The next storm could still kill her. But the fish gave her just enough energy, just enough hope to try for one more day. She returned to work. The foundation called to her, those old stones already fitted and leveled by someone long dead who'd faced this same wilderness and survived long enough to build. Mara began laying logs, using the foundation as her base. She notched the logs where they met at corners, having learned the technique from a wilderness survival book she'd studied in the library. The work was imperfect, her cuts rough, the fits loose, but slowly, over the course of a week, walls began to rise. She worked through pain, through cold, through exhaustion that made her dizzy. She worked through 2 more storms, abandoning her building to huddle in the lean-to when the weather turned vicious, then resuming as soon as it cleared. She worked through nights when her hands hurt so badly she couldn't sleep, through mornings when her back spasmed at the first movement, through a terrible afternoon when she slipped while carrying a log and fell hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs and leave her gasping in the snow. Certain she'd broken something vital, but nothing broke. Her body, pushed beyond what she'd thought possible, adapted. Muscles grew. Calluses formed. She learned to read the weather by the feel of the air, to predict storms hours before they arrived by the quality of light and the behavior of what few birds remained. She learned to move efficiently, conserving energy, making each action count. 3 weeks after starting the walls, Mara placed the final log. The cabin stood roughly 8 feet tall at its peak, the walls forming a solid rectangle on the old foundation. It wasn't beautiful. The logs were different sizes, the notching crude, the gaps between them wide enough to see through in places. But it was walls. It was progress. It was something. The roof presented a new challenge. She had no proper roofing materials, no shingles or metal sheeting. She would have to improvise. Mara cut smaller diameter trees and laid them across the walls as rafters, spacing them roughly a foot apart. On top of these, she laid branches perpendicular, creating a lattice. Over this framework, she layered pine boughs in overlapping rows, working from the bottom up so that water would run off. The technique was ancient, something indigenous peoples had used for centuries, and Mara hoped it would hold. When the last pine bough was placed, she stood back and looked at what she'd created. It wasn't much. Just a rough box of logs with a green roof and gaps in the walls. But it was a cabin. She had built a cabin. 16 years old, alone in the wilderness, and she had created shelter with her own 2 hands. She cried then for the first time since her father's death. Not from sadness, but from something more complicated. Grief and pride and exhaustion and a fierce, almost angry joy that she had not given up, that she was still here, still fighting, still building. The cabin needed a door, needed thinking between the logs, needed a proper floor and a stove for heat. But those challenges could wait. That night, Mara slept inside her creation, still in her sleeping bag but protected now by solid walls and a roof. The temperature had dropped to single digits, and snow fell steadily outside. But inside her cabin, she was warmer than she'd been since arriving in the mountains. Not warm exactly, but warmer. And that incremental improvement felt like victory. December arrived with a cold that made November seem mild by comparison. The creek froze solid. The snow measured in feet rather than inches. Mara's food supplies had dwindled to nothing a week earlier, forcing her to rely entirely on what she could catch or find. She'd fashioned crude snares from wire salvaged from old fencing she'd discovered half buried near the creek, and these occasionally caught rabbits or squirrels. Each catch was a small miracle that could sustain her for 2 or 3 days if she was careful. The gaps between logs in her cabin walls had become critical vulnerabilities. Wind found every opening, and snow filtered through during storms. Mara needed chinking, some material to fill the gaps and make the walls truly solid. The traditional method used mud or clay mixed with grass, but the ground was frozen solid and wouldn't yield materials. She experimented with alternatives, packing snow mixed with pine needles into the gaps. This helped somewhat, but melted when she built fires inside the cabin, creating more problems than it solved. The answer came from the remains of the old structure, whose foundation she'd built upon. Exploring the area more thoroughly, Mara found scattered debris from the original cabin buried under snow and decades of forest growth. Most was rotted beyond use, but she discovered something valuable: chunks of clay-based chinking that had been used in the original construction, preserved in the places where they'd fallen and been protected from moisture. The material had hardened over the years to a nearly stone-like consistency. She couldn't use it directly, but it gave her an idea. Following the creek downstream, Mara found a place where the bank exposed striated earth. She built a fire directly against this earth, feeding it for hours until the heat penetrated deep enough to thaw the frozen ground. Then she dug, extracting clay that she mixed with water from the creek and grass she'd gathered and dried inside the cabin. The mixture was crude but effective. She packed it between the logs, working methodically around the cabin's perimeter. The chinking transformed the structure. The constant wind that had whistled through gaps stopped. The snow that had filtered inside during storms stayed outside. Combined with the small fires she maintained in the stone-lined fire pit she'd built in the cabin's center, vented through a hole in the roof, the interior. Temperature rose enough that she could occasionally remove her outer jacket, a luxury that felt extraordinary. But fire needed fuel, and fuel meant wood. Mara established a routine: mornings spent cutting and gathering firewood, afternoons dedicated to improving the cabin or hunting for food, evenings spent by the fire, maintaining tools and planning the next day's work. The routine was exhausting but kept her alive, kept her moving, kept the darkness of loneliness and grief from consuming her entirely. It was during one of her firewood gathering expeditions, on a crystalline December morning when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at, that Mara made her discovery. She'd been ranging farther from the cabin lately, seeking standing dead trees that hadn't already been harvested. Nearly a mile from her valley, following a frozen stream bed, she came upon a structure she hadn't seen before: a barn, half collapsed but still partially standing, its weathered boards the same silver-gray as the forest around it. Mara approached cautiously. The barn was old, probably contemporary with the original cabin on her foundation. It had been hidden from her earlier explorations by the terrain and heavy forest, visible only from this particular approach. The roof had caved in on one side, and the large doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. But the side nearest her appeared relatively intact. She pushed through the snow to the doors, pulling one open with effort. It scraped across ice and debris, revealing a dark interior that smelled of old hay and decay and something else: the dry, almost sweet scent of aged wood. Light filtered through gaps in the walls and the collapsed section of roof, illuminating dancing dust motes. The barn's interior was larger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 feet deep and 20 wide. Old stalls lined one wall, their partitions mostly intact. Remnants of farming equipment too large or unwieldy to remove rusted in corners, parts of a plow, a broken harness, metal items whose original purposes she couldn't identify. The floor was hard-packed earth, frozen solid now, littered with debris. Mara moved deeper into the space, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. Something about this place felt different from the random debris she'd found scattered around the valley. This felt more deliberate, as if someone had left it with the intention of returning. Her foot struck something solid beneath a pile of ancient hay, and she bent to investigate. A wooden chest roughly 2 feet on each side, with iron corners and a hasp that showed no lock. The chest was heavy, made from cedar that had resisted decay despite the years. With trembling hands, Mara lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in canvas that had protected them from moisture, lay treasures. A set of woodworking tools in far better condition than her father's, planes and chisels and spokeshaves of professional quality, a coil of rope thick and strong, 3 woolen blankets, moth-eaten in places but still largely intact, a collection of metal traps, rusted but potentially serviceable, and beneath everything, wrapped in oilcloth, a dozen packages labeled in faded handwriting: turnip seeds, carrot seeds, radish, kale. Mara sat back on her heels, hardly daring to believe what she'd found. The tools alone were extraordinary. With proper woodworking equipment, she could make her cabin truly weatherproof, could build furniture, could create rather than merely cobble together. The blankets would make the difference between painful cold and tolerable nights. The rope had 1,000 uses. The traps could provide consistent food, but the seeds were hope itself. They represented a future beyond mere winter survival. They meant that when spring came, if she survived to see it, she could plant, could grow food, could establish something permanent. Her throat tightened with emotion as she held the packages, handling them with reverence. There was more. Further exploration of the barn revealed a workshop area built into one corner, where shelves still held mason jars containing nails, screws, and hardware that had survived the decades. She found a box of candles, their wax hardened but still usable, a small hand crank drill, a whetstone for sharpening. Each item was a gift from the past, left by someone who had lived in this valley long enough to establish these supplies, then abandoned them for reasons Mara would never know. Over the next 3 days, she made multiple trips between the barn and her cabin, transporting everything useful. The tools went first, precious cargo she carried with extreme care. Then the blankets and rope, the traps cleaned and oiled with fat she'd rendered from a rabbit. The seeds, stored carefully in the driest corner of her cabin. Each package a promise she made to herself. I will survive long enough to plant these. The professional quality tools transformed what was possible. Using a proper plane, Mara crafted a door for her cabin from boards she milled from a fallen cedar. The door fit its frame well enough that it could be barred from inside, making her shelter secure in a way it hadn't been before. She built a simple bed frame, getting herself off the cold floor. She constructed shelves for organizing her supplies, making the cabin feel less like a desperate survival shelter and more like an actual home. The woodworking also served another purpose. It kept her hands busy during the long winter evenings when loneliness pressed in like a physical weight. She carved spoons and bowls, practicing techniques she'd watched her father use. She made repairs to her tools, fashioned handles for the rusty implements from the barn. She planned and built a better system for venting the fire, creating a stone chimney that drew smoke more efficiently and reduced the amount that collected inside the cabin. With the improved traps from the barn, her food situation stabilized. She established a trap line, a circuit of a dozen traps checked each morning. The yield wasn't consistent, but it was better than relying on chance. She learned to preserve meat by smoking it over her fire, by freezing it in the naturally refrigerated space beneath a loose floorboard where the ground stayed consistently below freezing, but the cold continued to deepen. January brought temperatures that dropped to 20 below zero on the worst nights, and Mara huddled under all 3 woolen blankets, plus her sleeping bag, feeding the fire constantly, watching the flames with exhausted vigilance, because letting the fire die would mean hypothermia within hours. It was during one of these brutal cold snaps that sickness came. Mara had been feeling off for several days, tired beyond her usual exhaustion, her throat raw, her body aching. She'd pushed through it, needing to check traps, needing to gather wood, unable to afford rest when survival required constant work. Then one morning she woke to find she couldn't get out of bed. Her head pounded. Her body alternated between chills that made her shake uncontrollably and fever that drenched her in sweat. Her throat was so swollen she could barely swallow. She tried to rise, to tend the fire that had burned down to coals and collapsed, her legs refusing to support her weight. For 3 days, Mara existed in a haze of sickness. The fire died completely, and the cabin grew so cold her water froze in its container. She drifted in and out of consciousness, wrapped in every blanket she owned, but still shaking with cold and fever. In her delirium, she saw her mother tending the garden that no longer existed, saw her father in his workshop building furniture from wood that had burned to ash. They didn't speak to her, just worked at their tasks, and she tried to call out to them but couldn't make her voice work. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Mara woke to weak sunlight filtering through gaps in her door, to a cabin so cold she could see her breath in thick clouds. The fire pit held only dead ashes. She was desperately thirsty. Her lips cracked and bleeding, her mouth tasting of sickness. For a long moment she simply lay there, too weak to move, wondering if this was how it would end, not in some dramatic struggle against the elements, but in quiet defeat, her body simply giving up. Then, with monumental effort, she pushed herself upright. The world swam, and she thought she might vomit, but she remained conscious. She crawled to the fire pit on hands and knees, unable to stand, and with shaking hands, began the process of rebuilding the fire. It took multiple attempts. Her coordination was shot, her hands wouldn't work properly, but eventually flame caught. Smoke rose. Heat, precious and life-giving, began to radiate. She melted ice for water and drank until her stomach protested, then drank more. She found a piece of smoked rabbit meat and forced herself to eat despite having no appetite. The food stayed down. She fed the fire, added more wood, felt warmth slowly returning to her extremities. Recovery took days. The sickness had cost her more than just time. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and her strength was significantly diminished. But she survived it. Another crisis weathered, another test passed, though barely. The illness taught her something important. She couldn't afford to push herself to exhaustion anymore. Running herself into the ground had left her vulnerable to sickness that could have killed her. She needed to be smarter, more strategic about conserving energy. So she adjusted her routine, allowing time for rest, for recovery, for something beyond constant labor. It was during these forced rest periods that Mara began to truly appreciate what she'd created. The cabin, which had started as a desperate survival project, had become something more. The walls she'd raised kept out the killing wind. The roof she'd built shed snow without collapsing. The door she'd crafted provided security. The fire she maintained offered warmth and the ability to cook and purify water. And the space itself, this small rectangle of logs and chinked gaps, had become hers in a way nothing ever had before. She'd lost everything to the fire, her home, her family, her entire previous life. But from that loss, alone in a wilderness that tried daily to kill her, she'd built something that couldn't be taken away because it existed, not just in the physical structure of logs and stone, but in the knowledge and capability she'd developed in creating it. She'd proved to herself that she could start with nothing and build shelter, could face winter and survival, could endure loneliness and fear, and still wake up each morning and choose to continue. February arrived with slightly longer days and temperatures that, while still brutal, occasionally rose above zero. Mara's trapline provided steady enough protein that she stopped losing weight. The cabin held heat better as she continued to improve its weatherproofing. And slowly, incrementally, she began to believe that she might actually survive until spring. She found joy in unexpected places, the way morning light illuminated frost patterns on the inside of her door, the satisfaction of a well-fitted joint in a piece of woodworking, the taste of herb tea made from needles of Douglas fir, bitter but warm and containing enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy, the constellation of stars visible through gaps in the roof on clear nights, so bright and numerous they seemed impossible. She thought about her parents often, but the grief had changed. It was still there, would always be there, but it had become something she could carry rather than something that crushed her. She talked to them sometimes, narrating her days as she worked. "Got 2 rabbits today, Dad. The trap you taught me to make, Mom. If you could see the garden I'm planning. I'm using your spacing technique, the one you showed me for carrots." In mid-February, during a week of relatively mild weather, Mara made a project of improving the cabin's interior. She used some of the professional tools from the barn to craft a proper table and chair, built shelves that actually held level, constructed a better bed frame with rope supports that kept the cold floor from seeping through. She hung the extra blankets as curtains over the windows she'd created by carefully removing sections of chinking, allowing light during the day but providing insulation at night. The space transformed. It was still rough, still primitive, but it was no longer just a survival shelter. It was living space. It was home. March brought the first hints of coming spring. The snow began to consolidate, still deep but no longer accumulating. The sun climbed higher each day, and occasionally temperatures rose above freezing, causing icicles to drip from the roof edge. Mara began making plans for her garden, studying the seed packets from the barn, measuring out a plot near the cabin where sunlight would be strongest. She'd survived. Against impossible odds, with nothing but determination and her father's tools and luck. Finding the barn, finding the supplies, she'd made it through a Cascade winter. The realization brought a lightness she hadn't felt in months, a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, she could actually build a life here. April arrived with rushing water as the creek thawed, with bird songs that had been absent all winter, with the first brave shoots of green pushing through thinning snow. Mara prepared her garden plot, working the thawed earth with tools from the barn, mixing in composted scraps and wood ash to enrich the soil. When the ground was ready, she planted with reverent care the turnips and carrots and kale and radishes, each seed a promise, each row a commitment to future. She built a fence around the garden from scrap wood and rope, not beautiful but functional, to keep out the deer and rabbits she'd spent winter trapping. She expanded the cabin, adding a small covered porch where firewood could be stored dry and where she could work on projects shielded from rain. She built a better chimney, improving the fire's draft and reducing smoke inside the cabin to nearly nothing. May brought wildflowers and the first tender shoots in her garden. Mara tended them with obsessive care, watering from the creek, weeding meticulously, checking for pests and signs of disease. Each plant that grew felt like a personal victory, proof that she could not only survive but cultivate, not only endure but create. She explored the valley more thoroughly now that snow had receded, finding a meadow perfect for future expansion, a grove of fruit trees gone wild but still producing, a sheltered spot where she planned to build a root cellar for storing the harvest she was determined to achieve. The valley revealed itself as more generous than winter had suggested, rich with resources, beautiful in its isolation, capable of supporting life if you knew how to work with it. By June, the cabin bore little resemblance to the crude structure she'd completed in November. Multiple improvements and refinements had transformed it into a solid, weatherproof dwelling. She'd added windows fitted with frames and covered with oiled paper that let in light while keeping out weather. The interior was organized and efficient, every tool and item having its place. The door fit true and could be barred securely. The chimney drew perfectly. Her garden flourished in the long summer days, plants growing with vigor that suggested the soil was better than she'd hoped. She worked the plot daily, thinning and weeding and supporting the plants as they matured. The physical work of gardening connected her to her mother in a way that eased the grief. Her hands in the soil, following techniques she'd learned in a garden that existed now only in memory, creating something new from loss. Summer also brought the reality that Mara would need to decide about her future. She was still legally a minor, still technically a runaway from state custody. At some point someone might come looking, or she could remain hidden in this valley, living off the grid, invisible to the systems that would try to place her somewhere she didn't want to be. Neither option was perfect, but the cabin, her cabin, built with her own hands from literal nothing, argued persuasively for staying. The first harvest came in July. Radishes, their peppery bite a revelation, after months of bland survival food. Then carrots, small but sweet. Turnips, kale, all the cold weather crops that had thrived in the high altitude environment. Mara ate fresh vegetables until her stomach hurt, then began the work of preserving the surplus. She built a smoking rack for vegetables, experimented with primitive canning using jars from the barn. Not everything worked, but enough did that she could see a path to food security through the next winter. August brought a heat wave, unusual at this elevation, that made the cabin uncomfortably warm and reminded her viscerally of the wildfire that had started everything. She thought about Brightwood, about the ruins of her old life, and felt a complicated mix of grief and gratitude. The fire had taken everything, yes, but it had also freed her in a terrible way to discover what she was capable of when everything else was stripped away. She'd built this. Not found it, not been given it, but built it. The cabin, the garden, the tools and systems and structures that supported life in this remote valley, all of it created through her labor, her problem-solving, her refusal to surrender, even when surrender would have been easier. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the knowledge that another winter was coming. But this time Mara was ready. The cabin was solid. Her food stores were substantial. She had tools, blankets, traps, knowledge. She had seeds saved from her first garden to plant an even larger one next spring. She had plans for improvements, a better root cellar, a workshop separate from the living space, possibly even a greenhouse for extending the growing season. The valley had been transformed by her presence, but she had been transformed even more. The terrified, grieving girl who'd fled into these mountains to avoid foster care had become someone else, someone capable, self-reliant, strong in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with the refusal to give up. On a crystalline September afternoon, Mara stood on the ridge overlooking her valley. The cabin sat in its clearing, solid and weatherproof, smoke rising from its chimney. The garden stretched beside it, the last of summer's crops still producing. The barn, though still partially collapsed, had been cleaned and organized, its remaining structure protecting her tools and supplies. The valley floor showed paths worn by her constant travel between cabin and creek, cabin and garden, cabin and the various work sites she'd established. This was her paradise. Not paradise in the sense of easy or perfect. Life here was still hard, still demanded constant work, still contained loneliness and difficulty and the ever-present knowledge that winter would test her again. But paradise in the sense that it was hers, built by her hands, sustained by her effort, proof that from total loss, something beautiful and functional could be created. She thought about the people who'd left the barn supplies, wondered what their lives had been like, what dreams they'd had for this valley. She thought about her parents, hoped they would have been proud of what she'd accomplished. She thought about the girl she'd been and the person she'd become. The sun tracked lower, painting the mountains in gold and amber. Mara turned back toward the cabin, toward the evening chores that awaited, toward the life she'd chosen and built. Tomorrow she'd work on reinforcing the root cellar. Next week she'd cut and stack more firewood for winter. Next month she'd make the difficult journey down to the nearest town to trade vegetables and crafts for matches and other necessities she couldn't make. But tonight, she'd sit by her fire in her cabin, eating food from her garden, protected by walls she'd raised, surrounded by tools she'd found and saved and used to build something that fire and fate and loss couldn't take away. Tonight she'd rest in the paradise she'd created, alone but not lonely, strong in the knowledge that whatever came next, she could face it. The cabin door closed with a solid click behind her, keeping out the cooling evening air, keeping in the warmth and light and life she'd built from nothing but determination and her father's old toolbox. Outside, the first stars emerged. Inside, Mara smiled. If this story of survival and strength moved you, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button. It really helps this story reach people who need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel and make absolutely sure you turn on the notification bell so you never miss stories about courage, resilience, and the power of refusing to give up. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's the hardest thing you've ever built, either physically or in your life? What did creating something with your own hands teach you about yourself? And share this video with someone who's facing their own wilderness right now, someone who needs to know that, from total loss, something beautiful can still be built. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you're capable of building more than you know, especially when you have nothing left to lose.